Welcome, everybody. Why don't we get going? Professor Bill Ong-Hing, our guest today, is one of America's foremost legal experts on immigration policy and race relations. His books include, and this, by the way, is just a sample, Ethical Borders, NAFTA, Globalization, and Mexican Migration. Another one called Importing Our Souls, Morality, Values, and Immigration Policy. There's Making and Remaking Asian America Through Immigration Policy, and To Be an American, Cultural Pluralism and the Rhetoric of Assimilation, which won a Choice Award for Outstanding Academic Book. He has at various points taught at the law schools at UC Berkeley, Stanford, and UC Davis, where he's currently Emeritus Professor, and he's also currently Professor of Law and Migration Studies at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Professor Hing has an extensive career as well as a practicing lawyer, having served as co-counsel in the U.S. Supreme Court case INS v. Cardozo-Fonseca, and he's the founder of the Immigrant Legal Resource Center in San Francisco and continues to volunteer as general counsel for that organization. He's also on the National Advisory Council of the Asian American Justice Center in Washington, D.C. Professor Hing is the winner of numerous awards and honors, and I'm very pleased to welcome him today to speak to us about title there, but Values and Fear in the Age of Trump Immigration Enforcement. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bill Hing.
Thank you very much. Welcome. I'm impressed that on such a beautiful day people want to come into the building. I'm grateful for the invitation. And it's such a pleasant drive to come up here. It makes me wonder if I should move out of the city. The day after the election, the November election, Donald Trump began to control my life. And I kind of resent that, to be honest with you. The very day after the election, I got a call from a former colleague of mine, also from Davis, who lives in San Francisco. And she asked me if I would come over to her children's elementary school because there were parents, primarily Latino parents, that were bringing their children to school, and they were crying. Everybody was crying. Parents, the children, they were afraid that they were going to start getting deported right after the election. And so the first thing I did was I rounded up a couple of students and we went over there and did a Know Your Rights training that since that day, since that Wednesday, we probably averaged doing 2 Know Your Rights trainings a week in various parts of the Bay Area. Anyone ever been to the type of Know Your Rights training I was alluding to? No? Okay. So what goes on at those trainings?
It's basically so people can understand what to do in a situation. It's like someone
I
can
shows
knock
up
at
at
their door. Yeah, like they have the right not to open.
Yeah, and they have right to remain silent. They have a right to an attorney, obviously, that kind of thing. And there's a lot more that goes into it. But so at USF, I also have an immigration clinic where there's another attorney, there's a couple paralegals, and depending on the semester, 4 to 6 law students that primarily represent people that are facing deportation. And in the last few years, it's primarily been children and women from Central America who are fleeing gang, cartel, or domestic violence from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and some from Mexico as well. And we continue to do that, but we also now have this whole component dealing with Know Your Rights, and then after President Trump's via Attorney General Sessions' announcement on September 5th with respect to the termination of DACA, for the next month, we're helping with DACA renewals because there's an October 5th deadline for DACAs whose employment and status are due to expire within the next 6 months. I'll come back to that for the right one. So when you all know, and we've been reminded ad nauseum of Donald Trump's campaign pledges with respect to immigration. Some people think that his position on immigration had a big difference in the election. Some people think that many of his supporters supported him because of his anti-immigrant sentiment. I'm not sure how many of Trump voters voted for him because of that issue, but I'm convinced that a fair number, a fair proportion. And so, like most politicians, I think he really has attempted to follow through on many of his campaign promises with respect to immigration. I think that it's evident that he believes in most of those campaign promises. And so I'm going to go over very quickly some of the different things that he's done and how that reflects on some of the things he promised, but also how it compares to other presidents. Because you may not know this, but President Obama's nickname from immigrant rights leaders and immigrant rights organizations, President Obama's nickname was, anyone know? Deporter-in-Chief. He was known as the Deporter-in-Chief, and there were headlines. He actually deported more people than George Bush did. He deported more people than Bill Clinton, and they also both have 2 terms. And so it is interesting to compare much of what Trump is doing with what, for example, George W. Bush and Barack Obama did. Trump started out within a few days of his inauguration with the Muslim ban, the so-called Muslim ban or travel ban, and and that was something that he talked about. That he wanted to cut back on Syrian refugees. He doesn't trust Muslims. He feels that they are that they believe in terrorism, that they advance terrorism, and his problem, as the courts have told him in both version 1.0 and 2.0 of his travel bans, is that you cannot indict an entire religion. You can certainly exclude large groups of people if you have good basis for believing that they're national security risk, but no one can prove that the entire Muslim religion or Muslim community is coming to the United States to do us harm and that they make up national security risks. And it's primarily for that reason that his Muslim bans have been thrown out of court. Now, it's true that the Supreme Court is going to finally hear that issue soon, within the next few weeks, actually. But most of the travel ban has been held in abeyance until the Supreme Court actually does it. And Muslim ban actually is not new. I mean, you could argue, you could make an argument that the USA Patriot Act, which was enacted shortly after September 11, 2001, was the beginning of the Muslim ban, because it authorized George W. Bush to actually do a lot with respect to religious profiling in the United States. And so, in fact, there were thousands and thousands of non-citizens from Muslim countries that were ordered to ICE to report to the Department of Homeland Security to check up on their status, and many of them were removed from the United States. So you could argue, one could argue that Trump's Muslim ban was kind of a continuation of what started under the Bush administration. Extreme vetting is the process whereby Trump has ordered his State Department and his Department of Justice to look very, very closely at people that are trying to come into the United States, mostly refugees that are trying to come into the United States. And when people apply to be a refugee, they actually go through a lot of process already. They are vetted initially by the United Nations, the High Commissioner for Refugees, then the UNHCR recommends those refugees to the United States. And those refugees then go through 3 security checks. And so, the refugees that come to the United States are the highest vetted, most deeply vetted people who come to the United States. Can mistakes be made? Maybe. But nobody that has come here to the United States and actually done harm, who's a non-citizen in the United States, entered as a refugee. Refugees are so highly screened that it's very unlikely. But the President of the United States does have the primary power to determine who can come into the United States as a refugee. That is one thing that Trump can do. Every summer, the President of the United States consults with the Senate and determines what refugees can come in and in what numbers. And so his problem with the Muslim ban was that one of his problems was that he was trying to stop a flow of people that Barack Obama had set in the summer of 2016. And he wasn't doing it right. But this summer, Trump set a new target of refugees, and it's very low. There's hardly any Syrian refugees on the welcome list for the next fiscal year. But extreme vetting is something that always happens in terms of the number of refugees that are coming in. He lowered the number of refugees to 50,000, which compared to most presidents admitted well over 100,000 refugees each year, and that is something that the president can set on his own. It's the number of refugees from where they come. Criminal immigrants. Every president has said that their priority is deporting criminal immigrants. Barack Obama liked using a phrase, we want to deport felons, not families. A lot of immigrant rights folks took umbrage with that phrase of President Obama's, because it implies that felons don't have families and that we don't really care about their families. And so George Bush, of course, every president has made criminal immigrants a priority. President Obama talked a lot about gangbangers. Here's the difference. The difference with what Obama did and what Trump has done is Trump has broadened the definition of what is a criminal immigrant. So if you looked at undocumented immigrants, under the Obama administration had what were called prosecutorial discretion guidelines, so that Obama tried to order his ICE agents only concentrate on these folks for deportation. Were there non-violent, innocent people who got deported under Obama? Yes, there's no doubt about that. But his stated intention was to concentrate on criminals who have been convicted of crimes, especially if they're undocumented. Donald Trump has said in his first orders in late January, deport any undocumented person who's a criminal immigrant. And by the way, a criminal immigrant is somebody who's just been arrested and not convicted. So his definition of a criminal immigrant for undocumented folks are people that have just been arrested. Most of the United States, most cities in the United States are not sanctuary cities, okay? And so a sanctuary city, loosely, the definition is a jurisdiction that will not use its own funds, to assist in immigration enforcement. They also usually won't ask someone about their immigration status. they're stopped for running a traffic light, no question about that. If they're arrested for drug possession, no question, but they don't ask about immigration status in a sanctuary city. Most jurisdictions in the United States, however, are not sanctuary cities. It shouldn't come as a surprise to you that most interior enforcement in the United States, and I'm talking about the border, most interior enforcement in the United States actually is the result of cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. The vast, vast majority of people that get deported from the interior are deported because they've been turned over to ICE by local law enforcement officials. And so, if you look at the data under the Obama administration, it was something like 70 to 80% of people removed in the interior were the result of cooperation. And so, one of the first things that Trump did was that he wanted to make sure that type of cooperation continued, and I'll come to it in a minute, by threatening sanctuary jurisdictions. If you don't cooperate, we're going to take away federal money from you. And so, so that it sent a message of a reminder to places across the United States that they better continue to cooperate with us. And the number of deportations, interior-wise, is up 20 to 30% in each month compared to the same period of time last year. So Trump is on his way to yanking away from President Obama the moniker as champion of deportation, or whatever you want to call it. So raids and the unleashing of ICE is related to all this because many of you are familiar with DACA, which I'll talk about in a minute. Many of you are familiar, maybe you're familiar with something called the Morton Memo, prosecutorial discretion. Mr. Obama tried to send a message to ICE agents. If people have been here for a long time, if they've got kids, if they've never had any criminal problems, don't waste your time on them. Go after criminals. That was the message. Exercise discretion and leave those folks alone. Okay, that was the message that Obama was trying to send to ICE agents. And the two biggest forms of that message were what they call the Morton Memo and the DACA Memo. The Morton Memo was in the summer of 2011, and the DACA Memo was in the summer of 2012. Both times that those memos were issued, Mr. Obama was sued by the ICE union. They argued that he's not letting us do our job. He's interfering with our ability to do our job. Both times, the federal courts threw those lawsuits out of court, and so but it's an indication of where ICE was coming from when it came to how they felt about DACA and how they felt about people that have lived here a long time undocumented, even though they don't have any criminal problems. One thing you should realize is that the Border Patrol Union endorsed Donald Trump during the campaign, it's the first time in history that the Border Patrol Union endorsed any presidential candidate. Okay? And so they picked Donald Trump as the first person. So when I tell you that Trump's election unleashed ICE agents, you should understand what I'm talking about. Every week you read various stories all over the country about people getting deported who had never been deported before, that Obama had placed on orders of supervision, where they would just come in and check every few months, and as long as they were behaving, they could stay. But now you're reading those folks are going in for their checks, and they're getting arrested and deported. And you're also reading about so-called collateral arrests, where ICE agents are showing up at an apartment building or a work site with somebody's name who might have been convicted of a crime, or who might not have shown up at their deportation hearing. They show up at the place of residence or the workplace, and while they're there, they ask other people for their immigration information. And if they don't have any documents, they get arrested. And so those are called collateral arrests. And so that's increasing. And so we actually have not seen the master of the ICE raids was George Bush. Okay, we actually haven't seen ICE raids of the nature that George Bush's administration did. He often sent armed ICE agents to work sites where there was a belief that ICE had that the employer was usually they wouldn't go, but it was fewer than 10 or 20 workers. But when they thought there might be more than 20 undocumented workers, they would target those work sites, and they would go in with guns, they would station themselves at the door, and they would go up and down the workplace and ask people for about their immigration status. That's why the Know Your Rights presentations are so important, because the Supreme Court has held that even unless they have your name on a federal warrant, you don't have to say anything, even in those circumstances that I just described to you. So, and probably the biggest ICE raid in recent memory was under George Bush. It was December 12th, 2006. He sent ICE agents to, I think it was 5 Swift premium meat packing companies at various places around the country, and they arrested 6,000 people on one day. And half of them were U.S. citizens that they arrested, it turned out. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen that under the Trump administration. Will we see that? Well, maybe some of you have seen news reports or seen this on social media that there actually was a plan for what they're calling a mega raid that was going to begin on September 17th in various parts of the country, where the goal was to arrest something like 8,000 to 10,000 people over a period of 4 or 5 days. And then the recent news a couple days ago was that they've decided not to, ICE has decided not to do that mega raid because of the weather, because of what's happened in Florida and the bad weather in the South, and they don't want to, I guess they want to be nice for a while and wait for the weather to pass, then they'll do the mega raid. The border wall, of course, is something that Trump has received a lot of publicity about, and I guess the last we've heard is that he wants taxpayers to pay for the border wall, and so he's going to make that demand, I've lost track of how much it costs, many billions of dollars. His own Republican Party leadership is not that hot on funding the border wall, but what's interesting in contrast to other presidents is that when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were in the Senate, when they were both U.S. senators, they actually voted for something called the Fence Act in 2006, and the Fence Act would have built a triple fence along the southern border, and they voted for it. It's very popular, actually, to vote for border enforcement, and there's drones already along the border. There's a lot of money that's already invested, in my opinion, wasted on border enforcement. So border has always been popular. They never finished funding the Fence Act, and but you should know the border is pretty well enforced. There's a lot of military stuff there. There are drones. There's high-tech stuff. But Mr. Trump actually wants to see a physical wall, and he may end up getting it yet, and I'll explain why in a minute. 287G agreements, those are agreements where local law enforcement get deputized by ICE to help them do immigration enforcement. And they usually get paid for doing federal work, although there's serious studies that they actually don't make that much money. In fact, in some cases they lose money. But under a 287G agreement, a local sheriff can be deputized for doing immigration enforcement. The most infamous example of that was Sheriff Joe Arpaio in Maricopa County, Arizona. He took the 287 agreement to extreme, where he began to racially profile and et cetera, and we've all probably read about him in the last couple of weeks because he just got a pardon. And the Obama administration canceled that 287 agreement and then turned around and sued him as well for racial profiling. But Trump has, and the Obama administration reduced 287 agreements to, I think it went down to about 20 agreements, down from a high of 70 under George Bush, and now they're increasing again. There's already more than 50 new 287 agreements that have been signed. If any of you look at the paper this morning, Jerry Brown is about to sign SB 54, which would, he doesn't like to use the word sanctuary, but which would make California a sanctuary state. And one of the things that SB 54 would do, which is everything else I said about what a sanctuary city does, that would apply to everybody in California now, every law enforcement. But it also would outlaw 287G agreements, so that local law enforcement cannot, in California, can no longer enter into 287G agreements with ICE. The Secure Communities program is a fingerprint sharing program that Obama became the king of. It's when a local police officer arrests you or fingerprints you, your fingerprints automatically go to the FBI, because the local sheriff or the local police officer wants to make sure that you're not somebody ran away from jail, an escapee, or you're wanted for murder. They do that for due diligence. What Obama did was that he said, well, since you're sending it to the FBI, then ICE should get those fingerprints too. And as a result, many people got deported as a result of the Secure Community programs, including domestic violence victims got deported under the Secure. How did that happen? When there's a domestic violence call, the police often do not know who's the perpetrator, who's the culprit, who's the victim. So they often fingerprint both parties, and those fingerprints go to the FBI. And so one of the biggest entities that was opposed to secure communities were actually domestic violence service providers. So Obama terminated that in November 2014 after a lot of complaints. But Trump has restarted the Secure Communities fingerprint sharing program. Sanctuary cities funding threat. Several sanctuary cities have filed lawsuits against the Trump administration for the threat of losing federal funding. Chicago, San Francisco, Santa Clara County, Seattle. They've all sued over it. In my opinion, the Trump administration will lose these cases. Yes, you can condition certain federal funding on behaving a certain way if you want our federal money. Federal government can do that. But the spending clause cases that have ruled on these kinds of conditional granting say that the penalty can only be a 5 to 10% penalty. If you do more than that, then it becomes coercion. And coercion is a violation of the 10th Amendment, which nobody knows what the 10th Amendment is. The 10th Amendment is that that the federal government cannot co-opt the local government or state government. The federal government cannot commandeer local or state law enforcement to do its job for them. So if you penalize more than 5 to 10%, you become coercive and co-opting. So I think the sanctuary funding threat is bogus. The widespread fear, I won't spend that much time on it, although I've written a very long article on fear under Trump. I guess the biggest example of that is what happened the day after the election that I already told you, and it's real. I've been practicing immigration law since 1975. I've never seen the level of fear in immigrant communities ever than today. People are really worried. They're worried that they're going to get deported. They hear about all these random people getting deported. They hear Trump spewing his anti-immigrant rhetoric, most notably anti-Muslim and anti-Mexican rhetoric, and they interpret that as something that they've got to be afraid of. So it's real. And so DACA is something that Obama did because he was disappointed that Congress didn't pass the DREAM Act. And as you all hopefully know, Trump terminated this with a 6 months grace period on September 5th. And so as of March 5th, the program will end slowly. And what I mean by that is that current DACA folks who have 2-year permission to stay here and 2 years employment authorization, and for those of you who don't know what DACA is, just look it up real quickly afterward. Your 2 years as it ends, then you cannot renew. Okay, the only grace period is between now and March 5th. If your DACA is expiring between now and March 5th, you can apply for a 2-year extension. But the crazy thing about it is you have to apply for that extension by October 5th. That's just in a few weeks. So that means that even if your DACA is expiring on January, you gotta file for your extension now before October 5th. Okay, so if you know any DACAs that might fall into this period where their DACA is expiring between now and March 5th, you should tell them that they've got to apply for their extension before October 5th. And there are many, I'm not sure what's happening up here in Sonoma, but there are many Bay Area organizations that are having workshops over the next few weekends to help people complete their DACA renewal forms. In fact, we're doing one. My immigration clinic is doing one this Friday and Saturday in San Francisco. And obviously we don't charge any money, and we're also going to do our best to raise the money for the filing fees, because it costs $495 to file for an extension. And so we can't promise anything, but I'm pretty sure that anyone who comes to us will also be able to pay for their filing fees for them. But we're just doing it this Friday and Saturday, and you can find me on the USF Law School website and email me if anyone you know wants to come down on Friday or Saturday and get their help doing the document. So do immigrants deserve better? Of course, okay? That's the way I feel, and we can argue about it if you want. Why do I feel this way? Well, I'm not going to tell you about the perfect dreamer. The DREAM Act is what would have led to lawful permanent residence and amnesty for undocumented folks that were brought as children and went to high school here. And usually when people talk about DACA and the DREAM Act, they usually, my friends, immigrant advocates, like to talk about the perfect dreamers, the perfect DACA students that are straight A students that are pre-med and are want to be engineers and that kind of stuff. And that's all fine and good, but you know what? People who are not perfect, they also deserve to stay here, because and I'll go one step further. People that might have even committed certain crimes, you know what? It depends to me what the crime was and how I would analyze their situation. And so, one of the books that the professor alluded to when he introduced me was a book on NAFTA, and I wrote that book with one particular purpose in mind, and it was to try to inform the public, nobody reads my books, okay, try to inform the public what the effect of NAFTA was on employment in Mexico. Because I believe the public knew why so many Mexicans, especially so many Mexican farmers, relocated first to the cities of Mexico and then to the United States. I believe that if they understood why they did that, the people, critics would back off a little bit. Because in fact, agriculture, corn farming is a good example. That there really is not much corn farming in Mexico anymore, even though corn is very important to Mexicans. Why? Because of NAFTA. NAFTA dropped the walls in terms of any commodities going back and forth, right? No tariffs. What NAFTA didn't do, it didn't make up for the fact that the United States government subsidizes corn farmers in the United States to the tune of billions of dollars a year. So that today, when you go to Mexico and you buy corn in the store, guess where that corn is from? It's from the United States. And so it drove corn farming out of business in Mexico. And there are a lot of examples of that. There are manufacturing examples and that type of thing. So Mexico was the loser. I really didn't appreciate any of the politicians running. Bernie, Hillary, Obama, the Republicans, talking about how NAFTA hurt the Rust Belt in the United States. Nobody talked about how NAFTA hurt Mexican employment. So if you look at studies on NAFTA, it turns out that the United States came out ahead, slightly ahead in terms of employment. But it depends on the type of employment. But the United States actually had more jobs as a result of NAFTA than it lost. Canada increased employment a lot. Canada is the big winner under NAFTA. Mexico was the loser. Mexico lost more jobs than it gained. And so the whining about NAFTA and the whining, in my opinion, about Mexicans coming, and incidentally, Mexican undocumented immigration has been reduced quite a bit. The other thing that I would have us think about, and it's consistent with those of you who are studying more closely some of these issues of ethics and law. I like to, so let me start with this example, then I'll get to the legal theory. Ted Cruz, who's a senator from Texas, he was very, very much opposed to helping fund the victims' relief for Hurricane Sandy, which hit the south, the northeast a few years ago. It cost billions of dollars, and he voted against relief for the victims of Hurricane Sandy. Well, guess what? In the last couple of weeks after Hurricane Harvey, was that what it hit Texas, he's one of the first people saying Texas deserves this hurricane relief. Well, there's this theory of justice. That's the title of John Rawls' book, Theory of Justice, a legal theoretician, where you kind of and you know this. Well, let's say for a moment that you don't really know who you are and what your station in life is, and where you would fall until the veil of ignorance is removed. And while you're under that veil, you decide immigration policy, for example, and refugee policy. What kind of policy would you come up with if you really weren't sure what side of the fence you were going to be when the veil was removed? I think that should answer much of the question about immigration policy. People, I believe, would be much kinder and much more understanding of why people leave their countries and flee their countries, why people move. There are very, very few people from the countries that we are quote unquote concerned with, Central America, Mexico, Syria, other parts of there are very few people from those countries that are moving for the adventure. Okay? They're moving because of phenomena that are well beyond their control. And I think that if we really honestly put ourselves in their shoes, we would be a little bit more understanding. And that's what I would argue, is the way we ought to look at immigration and refugee policy. So let me stop there and take some questions or comments or criticism, knowing that I'm very used to arguing with my students. Go ahead.
Well, so you said that like there are different circumstances, I guess, regarding immigration with each president. Bush had his feelings, Obama had his feelings, and now Trump has his feelings. Is there anything he can, or any like concrete measures he can take that can't just be undone by the following president?
Well, if what he does is through executive orders or through executive actions, you're right. All that can be undone by a next president. But the problem is the harm that occurs with those actions.
I just mean, is there going to be, like, hypothetically, there might not be a legacy beyond this. Like, is there any way he could make a law regarding it, or is it just like sort of be an executive order and that's where it is?
He needs Congress for it to be the law. And so, yeah, and I meant to come back to this. The reason why he might get the border wall funding, or something that was discussed a few weeks ago, which was a point system of immigration rather than a family-based immigration system, he might get that if he bargains over the DREAM Act. Okay, so he's now, when he made his announcement, when Sessions made the announcement on the 5th about ending DACA, Trump immediately followed with his tweets and statements saying, it's up to Congress now. Congress, you have 6 months to do something. And he has said nice things about Dreamers while canceling DACA. So he's challenging Congress to pass the DREAM Act. The question is, would Congress allow a standalone DREAM Act to be passed without any other conditions? And would he sign a standalone DREAM Act? Most people think no, that he's going to ask for something in exchange. He's going to ask for border wall funding or more funding for personnel.
How likely do you think it is that you'll get more border wall funding?
I think he's going to get more border wall funding.
Why?
Because
It's a leverage thing?
well, I know this is going to sound silly, but it's only money. You know, it doesn't literally hurt a whole bunch of people right away, although people would argue with me that it does close off stuff if it's a serious border wall. And so I think that they're more likely to give him some border wall money and some more border patrol officers than other stuff. But you're right, your question is a very good question, that in terms of other policies, if Congress doesn't do it, then his executive orders can be undone by another president. Yeah.
So what are some of the different scenarios that you see that can play out over the next 6 months with this now being in Congress's hands?
Well, the best case scenario is that Congress passes the DREAM Act and that, with whatever conditions, for the Dreamers, for the DACA, that's the best case scenario. And that they would be able to all, as long as they haven't been convicted of anything bad, that they can all get a path to lawful permanent residence, a green card, and then citizenship. Everything that's on the table right now for Dreamers has a pathway to citizenship, which is good. It's not just creating a status that you don't get anything out of it except employment authorization. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is the opposite, that Congress just doesn't do anything and it all begins to die. In the middle are these bargains that might be made, that we may change the immigration selection system, that no longer can there be family reunification, family visas, that kind of stuff, which is something that Trump talked favorably about a month ago. Yeah.
Do you think that with such a focus on criminal immigrants in the media and during the election period, that the term itself, immigrants, is starting to signal stigmatization, and move into a bias? Because I think it's not even turn on TV the negative image of them.
Well, I do, when Bill Clinton ran for president the first time, I was an immigration lawyer. The immigration wasn't ever brought up during the debates. And now, it's like central to so much of stuff. I I don't wanna believe that just the term immigrant, maybe I'm deluding myself, is pejorative and that just when people talk about immigrants that it's really negative. But I know what they're saying is that because of the rhetoric the last few years, when somebody thinks immigrant, they may be thinking Latino immigrant, possibly Asian immigrant. And that might have, for some people in the United States, a negative connotation. But I do think that if that other people, and I hope it's mostly the middle that can still be influenced, that when they think about immigrants, they might think of their own parents or grandparents, no matter where they were from, kind of thing. But the media controls a lot, and you're right. And there are people that are trying to feed the media with positive stories and that type of thing. Yeah. Who's got it? Yeah.
You said that immigration wasn't brought up during like Bill Clinton's era. Is that because you think of 9/11 and the fear that it brought?
I'm sorry?
Do you think it's because of the fear that 9/11 brought?
Well, you know, Bill Clinton was before 9/11, and so the economy was relatively okay. And if you look at the history of immigration, usually it was tied to the economy. Usually, in other words, the pros and cons. We're a nation of immigrants, but we're also a nation that has loved to debate immigration policy from the very beginning. You know, George Washington said, "Welcome all immigrants to the bosom of the." John Adams passed the first anti-immigration law that dealt with, you didn't want to let French revolutionaries into the country. And so there's always been an ongoing debate, and who prevails usually, who wins in terms of policy, pro or anti, usually was dependent on the economy more than anything else, okay? 9/11 changed a lot of that, because 9/11 now, there's this extra layer of national security that's put into it. So you may have a relatively good economy that's going on right now, but you can scare the heck out of people when you say, oh, these Muslims, you know, they're the ones that are coming to do us harm, and what they're doing in Europe, et cetera, kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I think you're right, that 9/11 definitely changed the way policymakers view immigration, and I think the way the public views immigration as well. For sure. Yes, sir.
Can you talk about kind of the border zone? So the border itself is, you know, a finite area, but around the border within like 50 to 100 miles is actually kind of a different zone as far as legal rights and things like that, constitutional rights.
Yeah, good question. So at the border, and maybe all of us have gone through the border at one time or another, we know that we really don't have many rights when we're coming through the border. As long as you can prove that you're a U.S. citizen, however, you're usually not hassled in terms of your ability to enter. So within 100 miles of the border, there's usually more leeway, but not entirely. What the Supreme Court has said is that you still can't racially profile when you're following people away from the border unless you have reason to believe that the people are undocumented or that they're bringing somebody. And so there's got to be articulable facts of that. That's one thing that's going on. The second thing that's going on is that when some of you have passed through these border checkpoints that are away from the border, there's one in California between San Diego and Los Angeles near San Clemente. The Supreme Court has held, and at those border checkpoints you drive through, it's the equivalent of a border. The Supreme Court upheld the ability for immigration authorities to do that on the facts that were proven, I guess, by the government, that route was often used to bring in and to transport undocumented immigrants. Okay, so that you do see these border checkpoints in Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, and so yeah, that's where you have much less rights, which is near the border, but otherwise away from the border, and where you can engage in racial profiling at these checkpoints. But away from the border, usually, you cannot engage in racial profiling.
I think we're about out of time.
Okay,
Thank you
thanks very much for your attention.